What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. Today I'm going to show you some macros that I've created with GNOME Sequencer Enhanced, an extremely powerful add-on that allows you to create robust macros that can perform most, if not all, of your rotation with a single button. This can be extremely useful if you have a disability like myself, or if you just want to be lazy. Bear in mind that these macros can be extremely helpful, but they also have their limits, so they're made primarily for those who are playing the game at a more casual level. But feel free to use them as you see fit. If you'd like to learn more about GNOME Sequencer and how to use it, I recommend that you head over to Wow Lazy Macros. You can find links to all of that and to import strings for these macros in the description. Today we're going to check out the macro that I've created for Fury Warriors. Before we look at the macro itself, let's go ahead and open up our talent tree here. Now, I have done a Fury Warrior video in the past for macros. You maybe even be using my Fury Warrior macro for Dragonflight. And I really wasn't sure if I was going to have to make any changes. I didn't even know if I need to make a new video. But I have made a few changes, and I have made a few changes to the macro and also my build. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I've done here. There isn't a whole lot to go over with this build. Just a few little things. Remember that I always try to pick abilities that work best with the macro, what I can get the most out of the macro itself. So that's kind of what governs my builds. So try to keep that in mind. If there are talents you feel like would be better, feel free to use them, but I've gone with what I am trying to make work best for the macro. Okay, so good example here is Overwhelming Rage. I've taken this talent here. The reason why I've taken it is because it gives you more rage, and if you're using a macro, there's always a chance that you're going to overcap your rage. It's most likely going to happen at some point. It's just the nature of using a macro. We'll go over that more when we look at the macro itself, but having more rage obviously prevents you from overcapping your rage as much. That's kind of the idea here, so it was kind of a no-brainer talent. I don't know why I didn't take it in the past, but I've taken it now, and it does seem to be working better. After that, the only really big thing we need to go over is what's happening here at the bottom. We have taken an avatar, really straightforward ability, really easy to macro, looks awesome, works great, works well in the macro, off global cooldown ability, so yeah, no-brainer. And obviously it's just so good. How could you not take it? But beyond that, we haven't gone with Thunderous Roar. We haven't gone with Shockwave, though those abilities will work great in the macro. Honestly, they're instant cast with a cooldown. They'd work just fine. But I chose to go with technically a harder ability to macro, but it's just so dang awesome. And that is Spear of Bastion. I've taken this one. It's a target location ability. Those usually don't work very well in macros, but I've made it work, and it works great. And we will go over that when we take a look at the macro itself. So Spear of Bastion is what we've gone with. Now, along with that, we've also gone with Ravager over here for the exact same reason. It's a target location ability, but it's so dang powerful. It actually works really well with Spear of Bastion. So we've taken both of those, and we will make them work in the macro. We've also gone with just, buffing Recklessness. Pretty straightforward stuff. A bunch of passives. Don't have to add too many extra abilities. In the past, I had gone with Odin's Fury, but I've dropped that in favor of Onslaught. It has a shorter cooldown. It's really awesome. It works really well in the macro. I just felt like it was better. So pretty straightforward. But, of course, if you choose, just like over here, if you choose any of these other abilities, just, know you'd have to put them in the macro itself and replace them with whatever you don't use in my build. One I really thought about going with was making Raging Blow essentially an auto attack. And I thought about doing this because obviously it would remove Raging Blow from the macro, but I didn't because I didn't feel like it was necessary. I don't like this. It does change up the rotation a bit, makes it a little bit more complex, to be honest, even though it may not seem like it. And it just wasn't ideal. It just is easy to put Raging Blow in the macro. In fact, not only have I put Raging Blow in the macro, I've also given it 2 charges and given it a chance to reset. And so this was kind of my last big dilemma. I didn't know if I wanted to do this or if I wanted to buff Whirlwind, and we'll get into Whirlwind, but basically because of my decision about Whirlwind is the reason why I decided to buff Raging Blow instead. So that's kind of the idea there, but you could honestly, there's a lot of variety here you could do that really wouldn't change up how the macro works because you're pretty much mostly using the same abilities. But this is the build I went with, just, again, trying to make things as easy as possible. So hopefully that explains it pretty well. But with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at the macro itself. We're going to type /GSE to open up GNOME Sequencer. This macro is an all-in-one macro for Keph. It's called Keph Fury. If you want to use my build, you can copy and paste it here, and paste it into your talent tree, and you can use it. Or you could try to build it yourself and do whatever you want. But with that being all said, let's go ahead and take a look at the actual macro. So let's finally take a look at the actual macro itself. Now this is a sequential macro. I do this in favor of priority list macros, which is what I used to do, but I've found that with so many abilities in the rotation, especially for a class like Fury Warriors, sequential actually works a little bit better. And there are some things added in here that will hopefully make this work even better, but we'll get into that, okay? So starting off, we're going to start things off with Rampage, and then we're going to move into our target location abilities, Ravager, and Spear of Bastion. And the way these work is by adding an @player command, so it will put both Ravager and Spear of Bastion at your feet, and you can use those, and this will almost always go off around the same time, keeping them together in the rotation, which is always going to be great because it means even more damage. And the idea here is just to make sure that you are in range when you use this macro, so when it does use these abilities when they're available, it will put them where they need to be, because again, you're melee, so it's going to put them right around where all the enemies are, which is great. So they are very easy to incorporate into the actual macro. Next up, we have Onslaught, straightforward ability, followed by another Rampage. Now remember, this is a sequential macro, so it's going to be going down the list, and what we want to do is try to make sure that we get a couple chances to use Rampage so that we're not overcapping our Fury as much as possible. I've gone ahead and put 2 instances of Rampage in here to try and help with this, the best I can. Like I said, I can't guarantee that you won't overcap Rage from time or time, because it just can't guarantee anything with these macros. It's going to be going through the sequence the best it can and try to get through it as much as possible, but there's always a chance that you will overcap your Rage from time to time. So putting a couple instances of Rampage in here will help mitigate that as much as possible. Try to give you more chances to use up that Rage. Next up, we have Raging Blow. This ability is going to reset a lot. You're going to be using this one a whole lot in the macro, so it's going to just keep giving you something to do. But the macro is going to be cycling through all these abilities pretty quickly if you're spamming at it. So you should be getting to Raging Blow as quickly as possible. And that is something else to mention, of course, with macros like these, with all these abilities. There's no guarantee that you're going to be keeping things on cooldown as soon as they become available. There might be an ability that would have better been used at the moment that it at that very moment, and the macro might use a different ability just because of where it is in the sequence. So there might be a time or two where there's an extra delay on when a certain ability gets used. There's no obviously there's no player discretion behind these macros, so there are going to be times where certain abilities take a little bit longer to go off than you would hope because it's using other abilities instead. But again, that's just all stuff to keep in mind and understand. That kind of comes with the territory of using a macro like this. But I always like to try to remind people of that. Then it's going to be using Execute whenever your enemy's in Execute range in terms of their health, or when the proc happens. So it's going to use that as well. And then lastly, we have Bloodthirst. Now, that's all the main abilities. That's the cooldown abilities. The cool thing about Fury Warrior is it's a lot of instant cast cooldown abilities, and those are always the easiest to macro. But there are a lot of them, and so it's going to try its best to get through them. Now, we've put a repeat of 2 here with this, and that's because at the very bottom of the macro, we have included Whirlwind. Now, this is actually a re-recording of this macro guide, because originally I hadn't put Whirlwind in the macro itself. I had kept it separate, and the reason why is because Whirlwind is your filler, but you have so many abilities to use that in my experience, I don't very often see myself using it, especially since I don't take a build for it. I favored Raging Blow instead, and so I rarely saw myself using Whirlwind, and putting it in the actual macro in the sequence list, in the actual loop list here. What was happening was I was using Whirlwind all the time. And so it just felt like Whirlwind wasn't working in the macro. Well, I found a way to make it work, and that is by putting it outside of the loop list. So you have your main loop here with the sequence, it's a block type loop. And so all these abilities are in that loop. And at the bottom, we have a whole new block type action for Whirlwind. And so the idea here is that when you're spamming away at this macro, it's going to go through this loop twice, the sequence loop 2 times, and then it's going to try to use Whirlwind. And once it uses that, it's going to go back through the sequence again and do another 2 rotations through, and then try to use Whirlwind. So the idea here is that the macro is still using Whirlwind, but only rarely. It's limiting the amount of times the macro is going to pass over Whirlwind as an ability, and that way it shouldn't bog down your macro too much, is kind of the idea. So that way, if there is a moment where maybe using Whirlwind will buy you some time, get some other abilities back available, on off cooldown so that you can use them again, then that's great. That's what you want. So it's there to buy you a little time. It's there to be used occasionally, but not too much is the idea there. So that's kind of how that works. It's kind of something new that I'm trying, and it seems to make the macro perform a lot better. The only other option was to not include Whirlwind in the actual macro rotation and try to manage it separately or with a modifier, which if we go down here to key press and key release, we can talk about that now. So under key press, we have our standard targeting fair, and then, if you're not in stance, the macro will put you into berserker stance. So if you are in, like, say, defensive stance, then you would need to manually switch yourself over to berserker stance. But if you're not in any stance, it will make sure that you are in berserker stance. So that's kind of helpful. And then we have a shift modifier. So what this does is when you hold down shift, you can also use Whirlwind. So this gives you an extra chance to use Whirlwind if you're in a situation where you feel like you need to. So that way you can use it a little bit more if you need to. But otherwise the macro, again, will only do it occasionally once it's gone through the loop 2 times. So under key release, we have our straight up off global cooldown abilities. Avatar and Recklessness is going to keep these abilities on cooldown as soon as they are available and keeping your off global cooldowns working. And in this case, it should keep them going off together, giving you that much more power. I love it. I love that these abilities are actually off the global cooldown. It's one of the few classes where its cooldown abilities are like that. A lot of, cooldown abilities for other classes are on the global cooldown, and I'm always annoyed by that. So in this case, I don't have to bog down the macro more with these cooldown abilities and add them in the main rotation because they're off the global cooldown. So I always like to mention that because I think it's a much better design, and it's certainly a lot easier to macro. It just makes it more fun to use. You just hulk up into Avatar, you go into Recklessness, and you're just doing all kinds of crazy damage, and it's awesome. So works out really well. So basically, to recap, what's going to happen is your macro is going to be keeping those cooldowns available, keep using those abilities when they are available. You hold down shift if you want to use Whirlwind. The macro will put you into berserker stance, and then the macro is going to go through your main rotation with all of your cooldown abilities. It's going to try to use Rampage enough to keep you from overcapping Rage. It's going to do its best, and then once you've gone through this loop twice, it's going to use a Whirlwind. It's going to try to, at least, unless you're in the middle of a GCD tick or whatever. But it's either way. Occasionally, the macro will use Whirlwind. Is basically what you need to know about that. So that's pretty much everything you need to know about how this macro works. Please let me know what you think about it in the comments below, and I will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button, and feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.